I've decided to sit down with barrister Anna Loutfi. Thank you very much for coming in.
You're very welcome.
Appreciate it. We ran back into each other. We first met in the GB News Green Room, but it was recently at the Family Education Trust conference where you delivered a blinder of a speech. I hope that they actually put it up on YouTube by the time this comes out. If so, it'll be linked down the description. And I just thought I'd have to drag you in and subject my viewers to your knowledge on lawfare and the sort of constitutional human rights revolution.
Yeah. And just as a sort of qualifier, I think this is a work in progress. As I said at the Family Education Trust, these are issues that I think we haven't workshopped as a nation. I do not claim to speak for the nation. I just think these are questions and issues that we need to be having a conversation about. So I come in the spirit of starting the conversation, not with, confident solutions.
Yeah, no worries. Well, I think you're much better versed in the law often than I am. But we were saying off air, it's funny, no matter how versed in the law you are, no matter how much you try to learn its letter and live in the spirit of it, at this point, especially in the UK, it seems that the application is often arbitrary in favour of one's political friends and against one's political enemies by the government. And I wanted to kick off with something that we've probably both enjoyed in the last week or so. I haven't stopped smiling, which is the Trump election victory.
Yeah.
Because he was subjected to lawfare for the past few years. There was the 34 charges in the business records case in New York. There was a classified documents case that's been thrown out. Lots of these cases put on hold and now thrown out since he's won, which seems to be a kind of admission that they're afraid that he's going to recognise it was spurious lawfare and retaliate accordingly. Just whether or not you want to use Trump as an example, are you concerned about the use of lawfare and the impartial, arbitrary application of the law in the US and the UK?
Yeah, as someone who's trained in the common law as a practicing barrister of England and Wales, I am very concerned about the use of lawfare. I also have an unusual background in that I was trained as an academic on the continent, and my specialisation as a historian was codification of European civil codes and civil legal systems. So I like to think that I do have kind of an interesting sense of the contrast between those two systems. Not to say that common law hasn't influenced civil legal codes, and not to say that civil legal systems, particularly Napoleonic law, has not influenced the common law of England and Wales. I'm not saying there hasn't been traffic between those two systems, but they are different. And I think that the use of lawfare, as we've seen it play out both in the United Kingdom around the Brexit referendum and in the election of Donald Trump. And maybe the other side would say, similarly, that they've seen lawfare used detrimentally to their cause, whatever. But the point is that law is not supposed to be a tinkering with the political system, and law isn't a way of achieving political goals and political ends. And people who say that it is, fundamentally, I believe, misunderstand what law is, at least, as I say, within the common law tradition of England and Wales, the jurisdiction that I practice within, where there is the supremacy of Parliament on the one hand, and the judicial interpretation of precedent as it has evolved over the centuries. On the other hand, what we call the common law tradition, the doctrine of common law. So I think that that the use of lawfare to achieve political goals is a fundamental misunderstanding of what law is. And when someone presses me to say, well, what is law then, if it's not lawfare, a means to an end, a political supremacy of ideas that can be argued in the courts as having legitimacy and validity by virtue of their political potency, if not that, then what? And that is, I'm afraid, a question which I am very reluctant to go into in detail today, because I think it engages our willingness to ask the question, what is a people? Because I think, and this is highly controversial, but I think that law, as Carl Schmitt understood it, is an expression, it's an articulation. It comes after the fact. Where there are a people who have a common understanding of who they are, where they're located in the world, and what they see as limits on how they live and questions about how they should live, law arises over time as a way of working out differences within that particular politic, if you like. What we are now seeing is a rejection of the idea of a body politic. We're seeing a rejection of the idea of a social contract. We're seeing the rejection of the idea of a political community that is unified in any meaningful sense. The common law is a ludicrous notion nowadays because it just seems out of date, romantic, and actually delusional in a way, because it stands for something that has to be renounced at every opportunity, which is the idea of the past, of a past people, of a heritage, of a way of doing things, of a tradition, and of an identity, of a cultural sense of self, as a people. And that's all got to go, because what you now have is this idea of a pluralism. Now, Schmitt was quite clear that liberal pluralism is, by virtue of its emphasis on pluralism, impossibly liberal. It's a contradiction. You cannot have a pluralism, because if you have a pluralism, you undermine the identity of a people from whence the spirit of the law comes. And I think we're now in this moment, post-Blair, constitutional reforms that we've seen from 2000. Well, it really goes back to Blair 1997, but you have the constitutional reforms of 2005. You have then and also, of course, the Human Rights Act 1998, which codifies and installs in the place where there used to be a common law jurisdiction that was based on, conversations, a dialogue between judicial, executive and legislative powers with symbolic embodiments. Call it Parliament, call it the monarchy, call it what you will, call it the Lord Chancellor. Right? That was all disposed of post 2005. And then you got the horrendous, I don't even know how to call it. It's a legal monstrosity known as the Equality Act 2010, which takes apart the notion of any kind of commonality to law, any kind of notion that we have common access to the law as a people because we are equal before the law. That is the rule of law. And it starts to dismantle this notion of a people, and it says there is no such thing as a people. There are these competing entities within the state. And Carl Schmitt would have rightly scorned that and said, well, this is a pluralism that can only ever be resolved through tensions of an enemy-friend distinction type scenario, which, obviously liberals are appalled at the idea of an enemy-friend distinction. They would say, well, that's Carl Schmitt speaking his true National Socialism, his Nazi identity. But actually, if you look at liberalism, he was totally right, because actually what the liberals have done through the Equality Act is codify the friend-enemy distinction in a perfect way, which is to say that there are these competing groups of people. They don't have anything in common. And so the job of the law is to try and balance the rights between these different competing groups of people, which we all know is impossible because they are coming from completely different understandings of the law itself. So the law cannot be a balancing act. It can only be a managerial class that try to arbitrarily decide which group of people shall have supremacy at which point in time. And that has become the function of the law. And what's evaporated in that evolution is the idea of people who precede the law, or a common set of values that precede the law, and unfortunately, the reason why I said I think it's a very difficult topic for secular bods out there in the world. I'm not particularly secular myself, but if I were to put my secular barrister hat on, I would say, well, the problem we have is that there is no supernatural element to the law itself, which is why we don't understand what's happening with the Equality Act. The Equality Act fundamentally introduces a secular element to the law, which says there is no connection, metaphysical or supernatural, between the people and the law. In fact, the law's job is to tell the people what the law is. The law's job is to manage the people and to intricately tinker with their life arrangements and their ambitions and their hopes and their dreams and their connection to the place where they live, such that they no longer recognise the law at all. And then you get notions of two-tier policing or whatever. Two-tier policing is an inevitable outcome of law that is designed to manage people from outside the legal jurisdiction and people who live within the legal jurisdiction, because if the law were to reflect the people of the jurisdiction, you wouldn't feel this two-tier element. But because the law has taken upon itself to tinker with the jurisdiction and say, actually, we have to accommodate all of these other elements that come from outside the legal jurisdiction, and we do this using a human rights apparatus, we get this huge sense amongst the what I would call the domestic for want of a better word, the native population of the United Kingdom. You get this incredible sense of injustice, and that's because of the Equality Act fundamentally and the Human Rights Act, which has as its goal, its raison d'être, is to disconnect the idea of the law from the idea of a people. Now we're going to see an incredible resurgence of nationalism. We're already seeing it across the European continent and obviously in the United States, across the Western Hemisphere. And, the lazy liberal response is, well, that's just, antediluvian, romantic, disenfranchised, white, toxic men who just want to have the patriarchy restored and so on and so forth. And stupid women who agree with their stupid men. I mean, that's the discourse that we've been having. It's incredibly lazy. It's incredibly anti-intellectual.
I was going to say, you're selling me on it for a minute there, but there you go.
I mean, the point is that nationalism is the obvious response by a people who've been deprived of sovereignty and of the idea that they own a legal jurisdiction that they can call their own and that represents them and that has evolved over time to deal with grievances within that population. What the law hasn't evolved in England and Wales to do very well is to deal with grievances between different legal jurisdictions. So if you have groups of people who live in the United Kingdom according to different legal principles, and you might even say moral principles or existential principles or spiritual principles or political principles or however, but if you have enclaves of people who see themselves as radically not of the place, primarily legally not of the place, like they have a different legal order of things, the law of England and Wales is not accustomed to dealing with that kind of problem. And that's why you have to import human rights regimes into the UK in order to create what Schmitt would call a legal plurality, which is, the fiction. I mean, I think Schmitt would call it a fiction or a fantasy, that liberalism in its ideal manifestation as a legal state can manage these pluralities adequately and smoothly, and that there won't be competitions between ideas of the political and ideas of the communal and ideas of the social. And he said that was a fiction. My critique of Schmitt is that I don't want him to be right. I know he is. I don't want him to be right. I don't want him to be right in the sense that liberalism is a total failure before we start. I think there can be a way forward that doesn't have to resolve itself in ultimately political violence, whereby the state expels the enemy elements within it. But I think in order to avoid those kind of political extremes that Schmitt is associated with, and of course because of when he lived and where he lived and who he was, I think we need to have an intelligent national conversation about the ultimately what I would say quite fascistic elements within the equality regime that we have and the human rights regime in England, which deliberately creates friend-enemy distinctions and pretends that it's all about universalism and inclusion and so on and so forth. Actually, I think common law is a much better way of resolving grievances, even if you have people from disparate parts of the world coming in with different cultural norms, different legal assumptions, different ways of life. I think the common law is a much better way of trying to manage those discrepancies if we must have, mass immigration, which of course is a moot question. But if we must have it, I would say the common law of England and Wales is designed to assume a priori that we all have a common interest in living on this island. And then the grievance management system is before the courts, where you have parties bringing their complaints and treated as equals before the law in their complaining. And the solutions that they see will be not based on who they are, but on whether or not their grievance can be appeased. And if it needs compromised balance with the grievances of the other side, then the civil court will decide where you give and where you take. It has a kind of spiritual, almost divine role in arbitrating what is possible, given these two parties' seeming lack of ability to agree on an issue.
Thank you for watching that clip from Tomlinson Talks. If you liked that and you would like to see more, you can get the full 90-minute show every week on a Wednesday afternoon, live from 3 p.m, only on lotuseaters.com, and all of the other content that my colleagues produce behind the paywall for as little as £5 a month. Thank you very much for supporting us, and I hope to see you there. Until next time, goodbye.